of the best researchers that I've discovered is my friend Marco Vigato. I try to get Marco on the program at least once a year, but it's a challenge with him. We both have busy schedules. If you do not know who Marco Vigato is, he wrote an excellent book called The Empires of Atlantis, The Origins of Ancient Civilizations and Mystery Traditions Throughout the Ages. This is an excellent book, and I'll tell you, one of the reasons that Marco is a unique individual is because he works with the academics in Mexico and in parts of South America, Central America, I should say. And we'll talk a little more about that, but he has recently finished a couple of videos that I saw that are excellent, and we're going to talk about those today, and his ongoing quest to uncover evidence of a very, very advanced civilization that predates the Aztecs, the Maya, and the other cultures that are noted in Mesoamerica. So, hey, Marco, welcome back to Earth Ancients. Great to see you.
Thank you so much, Cliff. It's always a pleasure to be on the show.
Hey, and I never asked you this. You have a unique relationship with INA, the National Institute of Anthropology and History. I have discovered that when I'm talking to archaeologists in Mexico or Central and even South America, their perspective on history is much different than the Western culture. In other words, if you use the term Atlantis to a United States archaeologist or anthropologist, they tense up and go, we can't talk about that. We can't talk about ancient civilizations or prehistory. Let's just use the term prehistoric. What is it? Why is INA and these other archaeologists much more open to it? Is it because they have this indigenous background of these people that are part of their lives? And so because of their family history and because of being grown up in the culture that is much more loosely framed to prehistoric people, that it's more acceptable in these archaeologists?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I wouldn't still use the A word with many INA archaeologists. That's still a pretty taboo subject for most academics, whether from Mexico, Central America, or the United States. But what I have found is that many Mexican, Latin American archaeologists, they tend to be a lot more open-minded towards the possibility of an earlier civilization or towards the possibility that some fundamental chapters in our history or prehistory have been lost. So yes, I have found, maybe they will not admit it publicly, but I have found many archaeologists within the INA, within the what you would consider the academic mainstream here in Mexico, are pretty open to this idea of a lost civilization. And to your point, a part of that may be also a legacy of their traditional background. There are still many, many traditions, many both mythical accounts, ancient records from all over Mesoamerica that speak about how their civilization essentially came here from somewhere else. So that may be part of the reason why they're so open to this possibility.
I have to wonder that, I should say, if the American influence is greater than we recognize, because when I look at places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal and Coba and some even central Mexico in the turn of the century, the country that was funding the excavations was the United States. And so if there were any hints of the A word being used, Atlantis, they would quickly dispense of that and maybe are continuing to be a great influence on the continual growth of and education of Mexico. What do you say to that?
Yes, has changed over time, though. I think if you go back just like 50 or 70 years, yes, you would see a field that was still very much dominated by North America, and I mean mostly US-based archaeologists from these big academic institutions like Harvard, Yale, Princeton. We're doing massive research excavation campaigns here in Mesoamerica. But then I would say since about 70 years ago, since the 1950s, is when a new generation of Mexican-born and locally trained archaeologists started taking over a lot of these excavations, bringing in new fresher perspective, something that to me very well symbolizes this tension between North American and Mexican or Latin American archaeologists is the discovery, or what they call discovery, of Olmec civilization, because that was started by American archaeologists like Matthew Sterling, for instance, or
Right.
Rucker. But then you have many Mexican archaeologists who continued in their tracks, significantly expanded that body of knowledge. And it's interesting the position that many of these US North American archaeologists took back in the 19th, according to which the Mayas were pretty much the only advanced civilization in Mesoamerica. There was this very Maya-centric view, which was completely shattered during the 1950s and 60s with the discovery of the Olmec. And this was led in large part by Mexican archaeologists like Roman Piñachan, like Luis and Miguel Covarrubias, just to name a few.
Yeah. What is your impression of like the Maya that I speak with and the elders? They refer to their homeland as Atlan, a forgotten continent in the Atlantic. Well, we know what that is. Do the people you speak with in INA recognize Atlan, or is it a mythology that they're kind of thinking about?
Well, that's still considered a mythical account, and that mostly originated with the Aztecs. So we're talking about a later time period, the post-classic in the history of Mesoamerica. The Aztecs had several origin myths that named a place called Aztlan as their ancestral homeland. According to some accounts, that was located across the sea in the east. There is, for instance, a very famous Aztec codex called the Codex Boturini, which is on display at the National Museum of History and Anthropology, which depicts Aztlan as an island completely surrounded by water, from which the ancestors of the Aztec people then migrated into the Valley of Mexico. But there are also accounts that situate Aztlan on the mainland in a region that would more or less coincide with the southwest United States. So the location of Aztlan is pretty controversial, and this mostly belongs to the world of myth and mythology. What is true is that so many of the ancient Mesoamerican civilizations, including not only the Aztecs but also the Mayas, they had very clear traditions about the arrival of their ancestors from the sea, from the east, so from the direction of the Atlantic Ocean. And there are plenty of these accounts. For instance, Bernardino of Sahagún, who was one of those early Spanish historians at the time of the conquest, in the first half of the 1500s, he speaks about this tradition that the ancestors of all the Mesoamerican people, they came from the sea on ships. They landed on the coast of what is today Veracruz or Tamaulipas, and then moved inland to become the founders of Mesoamerican civilization. And also among the Mayas, you have very similar accounts in the Popol Vuh, for instance, the Annals of the Caciques, which are different religious texts from different Maya groups, the Quiché Mayas, for instance, who also speak about their ancestors coming from some land in the east after a very long journey over sea and land. So this all suggests at least a belief that was shared among the Mesoamerican people that their ancestors were not native of Mesoamerica, but they came here from some other land that was likely located across the Atlantic Ocean to the east.
Well, this is interesting that you bring that up, because I was curious about what the Mexican archaeological community believes were the original settlers. They still believe, like the Americans, not all of the Americans, but many of them believe that Bering Strait was the crossing bridge from Asia, Europe, or Russia. But there's more and more independent archaeologists who believe that they traveled and they migrated by ocean routes.
Yeah.
And actually, the South American archaeologists I've spoken with believe that Antarctica at one time may have been a place where the earliest ancestors came up through South America into Central and North America, which is not even considered by the American universities because it's not in their purview. It's like we need to have. I'm speaking about the United States. We need to have more of a collective thought when we think of the the migration of our ancestors. What do you say to that regarding Mexico?
I wouldn't personally go as far as Antarctica, but you're absolutely right. There are several different models for the peopling of the Americas. Now, the mainstream view that pretty much all of the ancestors of the present day Native Americans that came from the Bering Strait, so from Northeast Asia, has been challenged by several findings that show evidence of a very early human presence in the Americas. One of those, a little controversial, is this Cerruti Mastodon site close to San Diego that would push back the arrival of the first humans. We don't know whether they were anatomically modern humans, maybe Neanderthals, maybe Denisovans, but that showed there were people here in the Americas probably as early as 130,000 years old, years ago, which is a lot earlier than when this alleged migration through the Bering Strait occurred. There's also evidence from plenty of sites across Mexico, Central, South America that show a very early human presence, probably as early as 20 or 30,000 BC, which is again much earlier than when archaeologists, paleontologists believe this ice-free corridor existed between Siberia and Alaska through the Bering Strait. There's also this mystery about the so-called Paleo-Americans. There are obviously very few skeletons that have been discovered and for which DNA could be recovered dating to such an early time period. But it's interesting to observe that all these early skeletons, we're talking about pre 10,000 that have been found in the Americas, like the Kennewick Man, the Spirit Cave mummy, for instance, many found in cenotes in the Maya region as well. They show physical and genetic traits that are not found among living Native American populations. So that almost suggests the existence of an ancestral population, which is generally referred to as Paleo-Americans, which was then replaced likely by invaders or by newcomers that came in through the Bering Strait at the end of the last ice age.
You know, this is a big one for me, and I think you follow the same mindset, which is we have this Younger Dryas period where there seems to be a firm stop of culture, civilization worldwide, which lends us to think that there was a catastrophic event that wiped out both the megafauna and human lifestyle. And I've read your book for the most part. It seems to me, Marco, that many of these ancient sites throughout Mexico and in Egypt and some of these old locations are repopulated after this event. And this is what archaeologists and Egyptologists are finding. I've had a couple on my program. And there's a whole, what they're being called reuse of temples, pyramids. And this is a real problem because I think, and I would like to hear from you on this one, that the academic world is not recognizing the possibilities of a very antiquity period, tens of thousands of years or more, where there was a very high level of culture that was wiped out. And then there were the survivors who repopulated. And these are the people we consider the Aztecs, the Maya, and these other cultures that are frequently referred to as the ancients of Mexico.
Yeah, I think there are really two big watershed moments in the settlement of the Americas and in the development of Mesoamerican civilization. The first one was right around the time after the Younger Dryas, after the end of the last ice age, where you see this massive inflow of people into North America, likely from Northeast Asia, possibly from other origins as well. These people brought agriculture as well. So you have the appearance of our agriculture in central Mexico, in the valley of Tehuacan, Puebla. That's around 1000 BC, which is remarkably close to when agriculture also appears almost suddenly in the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, China, India, South America, and so many other places around the world. So that again suggests that these people brought a more advanced culture and knowledge of agriculture, crop domestication into all these different places. And the second watershed moment is at the beginning of what Mesoamerican archaeologists refer to as the pre-classic or formative period. So So we're talking about a time roughly 2000 to 1500 years BC, 1500 to 4000 years ago. That's when Olmec civilization arises. And what you see around that time is this sudden emergence of high culture, high civilization in Mesoamerica, the appearance as if out of nowhere of Olmec civilization, bringing in new artistic styles, new technology. And this is, I think, one of the big, if not the biggest enigma in Mesoamerican archaeology, where this culture that we call today the Olmecs come from.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the Olmecs for a minute because that's one of your sweet spots. I kind of want to think when I think of Marco Vigato, I think of the Olmec man. But there are some people that believe that there is a link to China with the Olmec, and there's similar in some of their writing. I've had a couple of researchers on the program that believe that they were into yogic Hindu influence. What do you say about their origins? I mean, if I talk to a classic archaeologist, like we have Ed Barnhart on the program all the time. I love the guy, but they just cannot go beyond their training. They can't consider any other origin of the Olmec. What do you say?
Yeah, I think it's very fascinating because if you look at Olmec art, particularly early Olmec art or art of the formative period of Mesoamerican civilization, what you find is a remarkable diversity, both in terms of artistic representations, in terms also of what looks like ethnic diversity. Now, this is a pretty controversial subject. I think anyone who attempts to claim that there were transoceanic voyages or transoceanic contact is immediately labeled as a racist or a white supremacist these days. But it's truly remarkable if you look at how these people depicted themselves or the people around them. You find the most fascinating combination and that mixture of different ethnic types. You find people look obviously Mesoamerican or Native Americans, but you also see people that look clearly Asian, and I mean mostly like East Asian, almost with Chinese or Japanese traits. You find people who look more like Black Africans if you think about these colossal Olmec heads. And again, I know this is a pretty controversial subject, and you find also people represented on stelas and monuments that look like Caucasoid, I'm not going to say Europeans, but definitely Caucasoids, maybe even Semitic. And you have all these different people apparently living together in the early pre-classic period. And then these huge diversity simply disappears. You no longer have those representations, the artistic style that you find, for instance, during the Teotihuacan, during the Maya period, becomes pretty standardized, and you find only representations of people that you would identify today as Native American. So what happened to all these other different strains they may have come to Mesoamerica? I think that's a really, really important question. Now, about the possibility of a Chinese presence, there have been studies, mostly by Mike Xiu, who analyzed some of those jade celts from the site of La Venta. It's a pretty remarkable collection. It belonged to an offering, which is presently on display in the National Museum of History and Anthropology here in Mexico City. And these celts, if you observe them, they appear to be almost like miniature stelas. You have all these different Olmec or Olmecoid looking figures. They're standing all around them as if performing some kind of ritual. But the most interesting part is that these celts are engraved with some symbols that look like hieroglyphics. They do not belong to any known script in Mesoamerica. But this researcher, Mike Xiu, suggests that they are the same type of script found on Chinese oracular bones from the Shang dynasty, which is contemporaneous with the Olmecs, dating from between 2000 to 1600 BC. Now, this is controversial because it's based only on a very limited set of symbols. But then if you also look, for instance, at Olmec art, you have many of those beautiful carved jade or serpentine masks that have very clear their Asian or East Asian traits. They look almost Chinese, almost Japanese. You have the fascination with jade, the knowledge of magnetism among the Olmecs, where you find magnetic compasses, for instance, at the sites like San Lorenzo. So there are many points of contact, but the same could be said, for instance, of the possibility of contacts with ancient India. There is a beautiful bas-relief carving at the site of El Tajín that appears to depict a very famous episode from Indian mythology called the churning of the Milky Ocean. It's completely out of place at the Mesoamerican site. You have many other artistic representations that would almost suggest a Phoenician influence. So I'm personally very open to the possibility that different peoples, different cultures discovered Mesoamerica or the Americas at different points in time and left their mark. This is not to say that they were necessarily the originators of Mesoamerican culture and civilization, which I believe was mostly and first and foremost a native endeavor, but they may have exerted at least some level of influence over its development.
What is the problem with the diffusion question, which is migrating, cultural exchange? And you talked about a racial diversity of Mexico in an early phase of its development. What is the problem? Do you think that the academics don't believe that man was sophisticated to build ships to navigate the oceans? Is that what the problem is? Because to this day, there is a sharp stop when it comes to cultural exchange from any other country but the original country. So that's called diffusion.
Yes, I do think there are two fundamental issues that academics have with these diffusion hypotheses. The first one, as you say, is I would say general ignorance, maybe, of the capabilities of those ancient peoples when it came to navigation. It's very clear that our ancestors from very early on had pre-sophisticated navigation capabilities. If you go back, for instance, into the time of the Phoenicians, many Phoenician ships that were circumnavigating Africa at the time or conducting trade expeditions to Northern Europe, to the British Isles. They're probably better suited for trans-oceanic voyages than many of the ships of the 15th or 16th century, including the boats that Columbus used to reach the Americas. So I do think that many ancient peoples, among them the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, probably the Egyptians, the Chinese, they certainly had the capability of reaching the American continent. But this is a field that has not yet been explored to any level of depth, that of the possibility of long transoceanic voyages in ancient times. And I do think that many of the archaeologists and scholars who have studied this subject are generally pre-ignorant about the nautical or navigational capabilities of these ancient peoples. And then there is a second consideration, which I think is also a reflection of the prejudice I was mentioning earlier, that anyone who even mentions the possibility that these cultures came from somewhere else or were influenced by voyagers from across the seas immediately labeled as a racist or a white supremacist. I think there is this sort of anti-colonial bias in a way, according to which anyone who even suggests these possibilities immediately labeled as a colonialist. I find it funny and fascinating because when it is seafarers from the old world coming into America, that's racist. But when you're talking about early agriculturalists from the Middle East getting into Europe and starting Neolithic civilization in Europe, then it's perfectly acceptable. It's not racist. So there is a bit of I think a contradiction here in which on the one hand archaeologists are very open to accept the possibility of cultural diffusion when it comes from people outside of Europe, but when you're talking about even the possibility of contacts between the old world and the new world, then this hypothesis is immediately shunned and labeled as racist.
I mean, you work with a lot of archaeologists, and I work with them, and I have friends who are archaeologists. There's a hard stop when it comes to this diffusion. What has to happen, Marco? I don't want to spend a lot more time on this, but do we have to find a CODIS that
Yeah.
says that they traveled from ancient Europe to the shores of Mexico? Or, I mean, what has to happen for this? Because it's becoming
Well,
a real problem.
we do have that. I'd say if you think about some of the early contact between Europeans and the Native Americans, there is a very famous letter by Cortés in which Moctezuma II, the Aztec Tlatoani, the Aztec emperor, tells Cortés that their ancestors were not native of that land. They came from a faraway land in the east. There are plenty of codices that talk about this migration from the east, but these are always considered to be mythical accounts and fairy tales,
Oh
as
my
if the
God.
Native Americans themselves had no clue about their origins and were just making up stories to please the Spanish. So that's at least the mainstream view, that these stories were all made up by the Mesoamerican to please the Spanish, but then it becomes hard to explain it when you find the exact same story told, for instance, in the Popol Vuh, whose origins date back to the very early times of Maya civilization. It also gives a very similar account of the arrival of their ancestors by sea. So you do have, in fact, many of these mythical written accounts. You have artistic representations of people that are shown as bearded, possibly even black Africans. They clearly do not look like Mesoamericans. And all of these is just dismissed either as fairy tales, coincidence, or just exaggerated representation of some very peculiar types. Now, I do think that in order to change these paradigm, we need some hard facts, some irrefutable evidence, as it would be to find authentic old world artifacts here in Mesoamerica. That's one avenue of research. And you may argue that we have quite a few of these artifacts. There is the famous case of a little clay head from a site called Calixtlahuaca, right
Oh yeah.
outside of Mexico City, which has been firmly dated to the 2nd century AD. It's of Roman manufacture. Nobody questions that the head is of Roman manufacture. It was found by one of the most famous Mexican archaeologists, Alfonso Caso, during a legitimate archaeological excavation at a then pristine site with no evidence of later intrusions or contamination coming from a genuine pre-Hispanic burial. If you look for it, you will find evidence. You will find a number of objects that can show pretty clearly pre-Columbian contact happened and they take place. Two other avenues that are obviously more recent are botanical or paleobotanical research and genetic research. Paleobotanical research is important because that shows that a number of crops, of old world crops, made their way into Mesoamerica and South America from very early times. And vice versa as well. You have the very famous case of the nicotine or cocaine mummies, for instance. You have even depictions in paintings in Pompeii at many Roman sites of what can only be pineapples. You have representations of Mesoamerican corn in medieval Indian temples. So there is, in fact, I think, lots of evidence that these contacts took place. The most controversial one is the genetic evidence. This is unfortunately limited by the very small number of genetic samples taken on Mesoamerican and particularly early Mesoamerican Olmec skeletons. It's fascinating that only 2 complete Olmec skeletons have survived that could be genetically tested. And whenever these genetic tests are conducted, there is a pretty strong evidence, or at least like strong hints at the possibility of different yet unknown founding populations of the Americas. There is this question about haplogroup X, which is a specific DNA haplogroup which has been found among ancient Native Americans and quite interestingly also among certain populations in the Near East that could potentially hint at a connection. There is genetic evidence that different populations brought genetic material into Mesoamerica, into the genetic of ancient Mesoamerican populations that did not come from Bering, from this migration. But these studies, as I said, they're still at a very incipient stage. There is still a lot of research that needs to be done, and the available sample also of skeletons or bone materials to be tested is limited, particularly for the Olmec world, because the tropical climate does not allow for the conservation of those kinds of organic remains.
Are you saying that there's a DNA genome of the Olmec that's been traced to other parts of the world?
Yes, that's there have been genetic tests conducted on 2 Olmec skeletons in an attempt to demonstrate that these Olmec skeletons did not come from Africa. And what these tests showed was that there was at least no recognizable African ancestry in those skeletons. Now, you can also argue the test was done on only 2 skeletons, so that's a pretty partial view. However, the same study and also later study showed genetic admixture from what is called a ghost population, meaning that it cannot be traced to any living Mesoamerican descendant or any known population of the ancient world that has been genetically sampled.
Okay.
And this is typically referred to in academic papers as UPOP-A, with a second unknown ghost population also recently discovered called UPOP-B. The reason why these are referred to as ghost populations is that geneticists have no idea where they came from. They do not match the genetic profile of any living Mesoamerican people or any extinct people that has been genetically sampled. Now, this is not to say that they came from the old world or from some other origin. It just says that we do not know where they came from, but they were likely not Native American.
Wow, I love that. I think it's at least 7, 8 years that you began developing an interest in megalithic research, and you formed your ARX project to begin researching this, which is just exemplary work. Before we get into San Miguel, which is the kind of the feature that we're presenting this week, talk about your interest in megalithic research and why you believe it is what I call the signature of a much earlier advanced culture.
I think it is very much ignored here in Mexico. When you think about the great ancient megalithic cultures, you immediately go to Egypt, Peru, maybe some of these great megalithic sites. But most people will not think about Mexico as one of the epicenters of these worldwide megalithic phenomenon, even though there are clearly very impressive megalithic sites in Mexico, even though they may not be as well known as some of these other places in Egypt, Peru, for instance. I do think that here in Mexico as well, we find evidence of the same worldwide megalithic culture. They built in a very similar way. You find sophisticated stonework, you find evidence of stoneworking techniques that imply the use of pretty sophisticated technology for cutting, raising these huge stone blocks. There is a colossal monolith which now stands in the center of Mexico City that weighs over 160 tons. That was likely meant for the city of Teotihuacan. It's a colossal statue which is interpreted as a representation of the rain god Tlaloc. And now nobody really has an idea about what deity that represents. It may have been a ruler, for what we know. There is evidence all over Teotihuacan, for instance, of an earlier megalithic layer that what we see today with the pyramids, the ceremonial avenues, the palaces, was in fact built over a much earlier megalithic site. And you find many remnants of these megalithic architecture throughout the site. I've personally documented several of these megalithic sites in very remote parts of Mexico, in the state of Morelos, in Guerrero. They show remarkable affinity with the megalithic structures of Peru in the form of giant polygonal walls, for instance, huge megalithic structures with perfectly fitting stone blocks monolithic architecture carved up directly from the bedrock. There is a beautiful site called Tezcotzingo, which was also featured in the Ancient Apocalypse show, which was a part of with Graham Hancock, that shows exactly the same kind of monolithic architecture, rock-cut surfaces, stairways. There's a beautiful, almost perfectly circular tub at this site, which bear uncanny similarity with megalithic and monolithic sites throughout the world. So it's really this similarity you find across megalithic sites, and the fact that those megalithic architectural layers, they always tend to be the oldest, upon which later cultures then built upon and erected their own temples, their own sacred sites. You find pretty much throughout the entire ancient world this pattern of reuse of earlier megalithic sites.
Can you tell us a little bit about your latest discovery, which is in San Miguel? It's funny because you open the video and you're driving everywhere. It's 3 hours from Mexico City. I really liked it because the site features 20 megalithic stones, and a number of them remind me of Tiwanaku in Bolivia, which I thought was a very, very interesting comparison. Talk a little bit about that.
So this is, to me, one of the most fascinating sites in Mesoamerican, one that has the potential of quite literally rewriting the history of Mesoamerican civilization. It is a site, as you said, Cliff, located about 4 hours away from Mexico City, called San Miguel Ixtapan. It's a pretty obscure site. You will not find it on any major publication on Mesoamerica, even though for a very short period of time in the 1950s, it was at the center of a very significant academic controversy, because you have these two archaeologists, including Charles Wiki, a very famous Mesoamerican archaeologist who wrote extensively on the Olmecs, who visited the site, and upon seeing these perfectly carved megalithic architecture, huge stone slabs, they immediately published an article suggesting the possibility of a connection with South America, particularly with Tiwanaku. And Charles Wiki was very qualified to make this comparison because he had studied extensively the ancient sites in Peru, particularly in the area of the Sacred Valley. He knew Ollantaytambo. He had done several excavations in Peru, in Mesoamerica. So he was very well trained to recognize those kind of similarities in stonework. Obviously, this was immediately dismissed by most Mesoamerican archaeologists based on one very interesting observation, the fact that these huge stone slabs, some of which weighed up to 15 tons, must have been carved with metal tools. That was the conclusion of those Mesoamerican archaeologists, mostly Mexican archaeologists, who by observing the very precise cuts, right angles, perfectly flat surfaces, very much as you find at Tiwanaku, there are some very small drill holes. There are only a fraction of a millimeter in some of these stone artifacts from San Miguel Ixtapan, exactly as you find at Tiwanaku. And what these archaeologists said is that you must have had metal tools, or even steel tools, to do this kind of work in a rock as hard as basalt or andesite. And so they essentially dismissed all of this incredible stonework as colonial. They believe they must date to the colonial period, to the Spanish period, and probably be part of some church or some sort of colonial building. And so that was the situation, that was the state of research up until the site was, in a way, rediscovered over the last decade or so. There was one very important discovery that changed this picture completely in the early 2000s, when two of these slabs were found inside a sealed chamber under the main pyramid of the site. The chamber was dated to 700 AD. Now, this is the dating of the chamber. We don't know if the slabs were contemporaneous. I actually believe the slabs were much, much older. They were simply reused inside these sealed offering.
How were they reused, Marco? Were they part of a wall arrangement, or were they built into the floor?
Yeah, they were part of an offering. So it looks like they created a chamber inside this pyramid, and they filled that chamber with artifacts. So there were statues. Two of these slabs were found there upside down, clearly not in their original position. Tons of other offerings, including pottery, ceramics, were found. It was almost like a cache. It's very fascinating. It's as if they collected a lot of artifacts that were clearly very valuable and sacred to them, and they buried them inside this pyramid. We don't know why they did that. Maybe it was to protect them from some invasion. Maybe it was as a way of sort of like ritually sealing and burying the site. But that essentially served as a time capsule where so many of these very early artifacts were preserved inside what is an epiclassic structure dating from 700 AD. The importance of this discovery, however, is that it showed beyond any reasonable doubt that these beautifully carved stone slabs are genuine ancient pre-Hispanic artifacts. These are not colonial objects. So the mystery now is when were they carved, by whom, and how? Since then, and also thanks to the work of the Arcs Foundation and of the local site director Victor Osorio, at least 20 of these massive megalithic monuments have been discovered in San Miguel Ixtapan and in nearby sites. These are constantly, new monuments are constantly being uncovered, which gives as the idea that this was a huge site. Everywhere you look in San Miguel Ixtapan, you see mounds that must have been pyramids. You find a lot of exposed stonework, huge, beautifully carved stone blocks on the sides of hills that were most likely pyramids. So that gives us the idea that a whole buried city lies at that site of San Miguel Ixtapan, that we have barely scratched the surface, very much like at Tiwanaku in Bolivia.
I wanted to ask you, it doesn't look like any ground penetrating radar has been done in that San Miguel region, but I think it screams for LiDAR just to give a basic surface understanding of.
Absolutely.
I mean, if it's a big piece of property, that would really help archaeologists understand maybe the layout a little better.
Absolutely, absolutely. This is actually part of a research proposal that we, and by we I mean the Arcs Foundation with the local site director, have submitted to the Mexican National Institute of History and Anthropology to start with a complete mapping of the site using aerial photogrammetry, using LiDAR, because our feeling is that this is a very large site. Just by an initial estimate of the size of the site is that it measures at least 3, possibly 5 kilometers long by 1.5 kilometers wide. So we're talking about a very large site. And all over this area, you find evidence of mounds, piles of worked stones, structures that suggest a very extensive site. Now, LiDAR would greatly help in order to map out the extent of the site and all these different ancient structures, as well as identifying potential target locations for conducting excavations, maybe conducting some trial excavations, digging a trench or digging trenches inside some of these mounds.
Has any carbon dating been done to any of the sites where?
Glad you asked that, because this is also one of the most controversial aspects of this site. I mentioned the dating of some of these structures to the epiclassic period, 700 AD, but these are some of the most recent structures at the site. It was one fascinating chance discovery that occurred around, if I'm not mistaken, that would have been around 2012 at San Miguel Ixtapan, when some workers from the local phone company were laying the foundation for a mobile phone tower on top of a mound that happened to be a pyramid. They broke into a stone chamber on the top of this mound, which contained a burial. Now, these people, instead of just taking the artifacts and taking them away, they alerted the local authorities about the discovery. And when the inner archaeologists came, they excavated a burial that looks like an Olmec burial because they found large quantities of jade, serpentine objects. There is a beautiful stone mask, which is made of a yet unidentified material. And when I say unidentified, it's because no research has been conducted. It could be jade, it could be serpentine, basically it's some precious stone. A beautiful jadeite pendant was found, which is totally Olmec in style, with some of those micro perforations that was just describing. They are less than a fraction of a millimeter. And some skeletal remains, bone materials were found that were carbon dated by a local archaeologist, Norma Rodriguez. And what was shocking was the date, which was 1500 BC, 3,500 years ago. Now, keep in mind that this burial was found on the top of a pyramid. So we're not even talking about the earliest layers of the site.
Oh my God.
So true, and if confirmed, that would show that this site is at least as old as the Gulf Coast Olmec sites, if not possibly earlier than that. Some of the earliest dates for San Lorenzo, for instance, are in the range of 1400 to 1200 BC. So this site would be at least contemporaneous, but possibly even older than the Olmec sites on the Gulf Coast.
One thing I'm curious about, Marco, is that the type of cutting used in these megalithic slabs that you present in your work are similar to Tiwanaku, but they seem extremely sophisticated, and there's no way of knowing what the cutting tool was because they're just such precision in the way they're formed. Is there any hint at what the technology could be?
So we have suggested conducting a petrologic or petrographic study on those slabs because of the nature of the stone. Now techniques have been developed that can identify traces of foreign elements like metal, for instance, it was used for carving those slabs up to 1 part per million. So obviously, even if you're using tools that could have been made of copper, bronze, or some other material, those tools inevitably would leave microparticles in the stone, particularly in those small porosities in the stone, which can be analyzed with the use of those mass spectrometers and those devices, those tools that are now used in the field of archaeology. So this is a part of our research proposal for San Miguel Ixtapan. We have not only the slabs, but we also have a pre-Hispanic quarry site that was discovered by the site director Victor Osorio and myself just about 3 years ago, which contains a huge monolith still in the process of extraction from a basalt quarry. And so that could potentially provide important elements to understand what kind of tools, what techniques were employed in order to cut the huge stone blocks.
Wow, that would be fantastic if you could figure that one out. John Burke, who did a lot of energy testing at pyramid sites at Tikal and Tiwanaku, measured energy fluctuations and emissions at Tiwanaku. And I wondered, has anyone done anything like that at San Miguel, or is that just too far along?
Not yet, not yet. There will be a fascinating line of study, but what I can tell you is that there's been a lot of research, particularly at Olmec sites, around the magnetic properties of some of the stones that were employed. There is evidence, for instance, some of those giant stone heads, several Olmec monuments, also from a region in Guatemala, on the coast of Guatemala, particularly around the Escuintla. They contain magnetic elements which give the stone a particular magnetism, and it has been shown that the way the stone was carved was in order to amplify certain magnetic anomalies that may have been naturally occurring within the stone. So I do think this is a fascinating line of research. It will be extremely interesting to understand whether those stone slabs are so beautifully, so perfectly carved with these geometric shapes where you have inverted T shapes, you have rectangles, you have different frames, were also associated perhaps with some magnetic anomalies properties or some specific properties of the stone.
I believe that our ancestors were very sensitive to geomagnetic fluctuations in stonework as well as emanations from the earth. In the San Miguel work that you've done, do any of the locals that are living around there or any of the people on your team have a sensitivity or have noticed a sensitivity to any of the ruins?
Well, not really, not as much about the site itself. The thing is that the site is so old, so ancient that even the local people they have no traditions about that or
Oh,
about
there are no
its
traditions.
its origins really. Like these are huge stone slabs, they're a mystery even to the local people. Like they've never seen it, they do not belong within the local artistic culture or traditions that you find in the area. So it's really a total enigma where they may have come from. I wouldn't say there was a really any like unexplained phenomena or anything like that, but you definitely feel a very strong energy, particularly in the area of a canyon that is located very close to the site. There are many legends there that talk about tunnels, caves. They're dug in the walls of these canyon. It's a very deep canyon, which I had the opportunity to explore, at least in part, last year. There was a pretty extensive exploration along several miles of these canyon. It's all built of huge basalt prisms. So these are essentially huge columnar basalt formations. And obviously, as you know, basalt is also a magnetic stone that can create different effects. Even in some cases, it's been documented altered states of consciousness. So to
Exactly.
be inside like a canyon that is all made of basalt and where people believe there are like caves or tunnels, I think it's a very energetic spot. And we definitely plan on going back to see if there is any truth to these legends that speak about hidden tunnels and caves in the sides of the canyon.
Before we leave San Miguel, have there been any sculptural reliefs of humanistic quality or figurines that might represent the earliest people there? And do you see them as a connection perhaps of Tiwanaku? Tiwanaku sculptures are they have a very flat headwear and they're very elongated and square. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me, Cliff? Sorry.
Yeah. Did
Yeah,
you
I
hear
think
what
the
I?
Yeah, it was just breaking up. Yes. So there are some anthropomorphic representations. They're mostly in the form of sculptures with cross arms. They look almost like Egyptian mummies. And
Yeah.
several of these artifacts have been found around San Miguel Ixtapan, but they probably belong to a later period of occupation of the site. The earliest occupational layers, they appear to have been mostly geometric. That's where you find these geometric slabs that are carved in inverted T shapes, squares, rectangles. So it's a very geometric art, very much like Tiwanaku, for instance, which I think, again, is one of the most distinctive of these early megalithic sites that you find around the world. If you think about sites like Tiwanaku, for instance, the megalithic temples in Giza, the Osirion in Abydos, what you find is there is purely megalithic, monolithic architecture. There are no human or animal or other representations, really. It's like very plain architecture, very geometric. And this is also what you find at San Miguel Ixtapan. So no, we do not expect to find a lot of anthropomorphic representations at the site. But yes, we do hope to uncover some tombs. Unfortunately, even the tomb I was mentioning that may date to 1500 BC yielded only fragments of bones, obviously, because of the great age. So
Yeah.
no complete skeletons. But you do have evidence, if not from San Miguel Ixtapan itself, from some nearby sites of the practice of cranial deformation. This is shown at many sites in the Valley of Mexico, Tlatilco, for instance, among the Olmecs. All these people, they practice some form of cranial deformation to alter the shape of the skull in a way to conform to some canon of beauty, or as many researchers also suggest, so they would look more like their gods.
Yeah. This Exapen location is fascinating. I can see and hear in your voice that you want to get back there as soon as possible and do more
Yes.
research. We don't have a lot of time to continue with that one, but I want to talk about Mitla, Oaxaca,
Mhm.
uh, and this video that you did, the various kings. And what did you discover? You are with this ENA team, and you're doing some significant work. Give us an update on what has been going on there.
So we have already conducted two research seasons at Mitla with another one, which is going to happen later this year in the month of August at a nearby site called Teotitlán del Valle. And what has been uncovered in these first two seasons using geophysical equipment is a whole underground network of subterranean chambers and tunnels deep beneath the site. We used up a combination of three different non-invasive geophysical methods, which include ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and seismic noise tomography, to map the underground, what lies beneath the site of Mitla, which is a fascinating site. If you've never been to Mitla, it's one of the most megalithic sites in all of Mexico. You have huge stone blocks, some of which are over 7 meters long. They weigh over 50 tons, and that continues under the ground. You have several perfectly built stone chambers underground, built with huge megalithic stone blocks. And now what these new research has revealed is that these chambers, these tunnels, they continue underneath the entire site. It's part of a huge network, of a huge labyrinth of subterranean chambers, which the ancient Zapotecs considered to be an entrance to the underworld. There are accounts from the early colonial period that speak about the tombs of the Zapotec kings as located within a subterranean labyrinth underneath the site, which was sealed off by Spanish priests and missionaries in the early colonial period. And these accounts suggest that the entrance may be found underneath the main church of Mitla, which is exactly where our geophysical survey shows that a very large subsurface subterranean anomaly exists, which extends down to a depth of at least 18 meters or almost 50 feet below ground. That's as far as our instrumentation could penetrate. But that then branches out right for hundreds of meters, maybe even more, across the entire site.
Now, you have identified 5 groups of structures in Mitla, and this wonderful video, by the way, those of you listening, I'm going to make this video, both videos available
Thank you.
on Earth Ancients, a group and international, as well as my personal site, because they're excellent, very well done. But this geomagnetic resistance scanning that you're doing is turning up not only deposits, but it looks like an underground canal system of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about that.
Yeah, there are definitely several different tunnels, chambers that all appear to be interconnected. So the research was conducted at 5 of the main group of structures that make up the ancient site. Started off in 2022 just focusing on the church group and the columns group, but then we expanded in 2023 the research perimeter to include some of the other groups of structure. What we found was, again, very similar, with several subterranean chambers, tunnels that appear to form part of an interconnected system. It's almost as if it were a whole subterranean city underneath the site, potentially containing and including several different layers, several different levels, and likely connecting to some natural cave system that may extend for miles under the area. So that's what I find fascinating. Now, all of these chambers have been sealed off since at least the colonial period. So nobody has been in there in at least 500 years. The next stage of the project will likely involve drilling down into some of these chambers in order to insert a camera or a photographic probe, maybe even a laser scanner, in order to understand the size orientation and the potential contents of these subterranean chambers before a larger scale excavation can be attempted. The reason why I mentioned those techniques like drilling or boring down into those chambers is that they're located at very great depths, in some cases up to 15, 80 meters. So we're talking about 45, wow, 50 feet below ground through the hard rock. This is not in the ground, this is in the bedrock. So that's the reason why we need to drill down to see what may lie below the site.
In the video, you present a monk who's there and he's writing the history of the area. I want you to talk, if you can, a little bit about that and what he identifies as a labyrinth, which I think is kind of fascinating.
So we found this ancient document in the library of the Inquisition in Oaxaca. The monk you're referring to was Father Francisco de Burgos, who was one of the most famous historians of the Dominican order and the Inquisitor General of Oaxaca in the 1600s. He wrote a very important book called the Geographica Descripción, which only survives in manuscript form, in which he gives a full account of the discovery of the subterranean chambers of Mitla. When the first Spanish missionaries arrived in Mitla, according to Father Burgoa, they found the entrance to a subterranean temple, what is described as a crypt located underneath the main Zapotec temple of Mitla. And there Burgos speaks of 4 interconnected chambers. The first one, which served as a shrine for the idols, for the Zapotec gods. The second one, which was the tomb of the high priests. The third one, which was the tombs of the kings of Teozapotlan. It was the name of the Zapotec province at the time. And Burgoa describes the mummies of these kings. They were laid to rest in these huge subterranean chambers, covered in gold, with their battle instruments, their weapons, shields, a huge quantity of offerings. And then the fourth chamber, which was according to Burgos, a sort of gateway to hell. There was a chamber which contained a colossal altar which could be moved, and underneath the altar was the entrance to a massive subterranean labyrinth, which is what Burgoa calls Lioba, which is a Zapotec word, which means underworld. This is what the Zapotecs believed was a genuine entrance into the underworld. And from Burgoa's description, you can tell at times that he may be talking about some natural cavern, because he describes these vast cavernous space that, according to him, extended for many, many miles in all directions. But then there are some elements in his description that suggest that this could have been maybe an artificially modified cave, because he talks about colossal pillars that were supporting the roof. He talks about the passages branching out at regular distances, like the streets of a city. That's the expression he uses, this massive corridor with numerous side passages. So there are elements in Burgos' description that almost suggest that this space may have been artificial, or at least an artificially modified cavern that extended potentially for miles underneath the site, which in my view points to what is potentially a much earlier layer of construction. So you may have had these huge underground city underneath Mitla, which the Zapotecs later discovered that they used part of it as a burial site for their kings, for their priesthood, and then they built these massive megalithic structures and temples on top. So there are many different layers to it that could go back to the end of the last ice age. That's the most fascinating part of this whole research. To me, there is evidence at Mitla of human occupation dating back almost 10,000 years to 8,000 BC. And Mitla is one of those very interesting places around the world, very much like Göbekli Tepe, where you have evidence of megalithic architecture and the first evidence of crop domestication and agriculture. We know that Mitla was the place in all of Mesoamerica where many different types of crops, including gourds, including corn, possibly were first domesticated. So you have this strange association, very much like Göbekli Tepe and many other megalithic sites around the world, between megalithic architecture, early crop domestication, the birth of agriculture in layers that may date back to the end of the last ice age. That's why I think Mitla can be an extremely fascinating site, and what we may uncover deeper from these subterranean chambers at Mitla has the potential quite literally rewriting the history of Mesoamerica.
It's very exciting what you present. You have some of it in your book, but the videos are just fascinating simply because you're finding all these voids and pockets and tunnels underneath these buildings. One of the questions I had when I was watching the video is, if you know that the priests were covering these entrances up, can't you just find the entrances that they covered and just open them up? Or is it too much of a problem?
Yes, we know of at least one entrance located under the church. It is located under the main altar of the Catholic Church of Mitla. And interestingly enough, that entrance was allegedly rediscovered in the early 1900s, probably sometime around 1920, when the church was radically transformed. New floor was laid inside the church, a new altar was constructed, and that's when, allegedly, according to many of the local people, the entrance was rediscovered, which remained open for many, many years. There are people still living in Mitla today who remember having gone down into those subterranean tunnels underneath the church until the entrance was again sealed sometime during the 1980s. So we're not talking about a long time ago. This entrance remained open for many, many decades. There are many people living in Mitla today who tell stories about having been inside those megalithic subterranean chambers that were later sealed off. The reason why they were sealed off is twofold. On the one hand, people apparently got lost in those subterranean labyrinths, and so in order to protect and to prevent people from getting lost while searching for treasure underground, they sealed off the entrance. And there is also a second reason, has to do mostly with the local Catholic Church wanting, in a way, to prevent what they see as a resurgence of those like pre-Hispanic beliefs.
Let me just stop you for a minute.
Like
So you're saying indigenous worship of idols is anti-Catholic, and this is the big problem. This is the problem with Mexico as a whole. Any thought of indigenous religion, if that's not what if we want to call it, or spirituality, is very offensive to the church.
So I can totally imagine some pretty fanatic local priest sometime in the 1980s just deciding to seal off those entrances as a way of preventing the local, still like indigenous people still attached to the traditional rituals, from performing their own traditional rites, which is something very much alive in Mitla today. You will find at many places in the ancient ruins offerings of candles, of incense. People still lay offerings to the ruins today. And obviously the idea that the most sacred temple of the Zapotecs, where their ancestors, their high priests, their kings were buried, still exists under the church, makes it a very powerful place for the local people where they would go and lay offerings. So I can understand why the Catholic Church, particularly 1980s, in the early 90s, would want to suppress all of that and completely seal off those entrances and sever that connection of the local people with their pre-Hispanic traditions.
But wouldn't Ina be able to go to the church and say, look, we know that in the main part of the church we have this entranceway. We would like to do research and open that up so that people can get down there, so that you have a history of these earlier civilizations? Or is it just too hard for the church to accept that?
This was attempted, and I will tell you a funny story. I will not name the archaeologist who was involved, but she's a very famous archaeologist, very active in the Oaxaca region, and she was at the time the overseer for the site of Mitla. So when once again in the 1990s, additional works were conducted inside the church, she was obviously familiar with these rumors about a secret entrance under the church, and she went to see what they had found. According to what she told me, she saw the entrance, which at the time was still uncovered under the altar,
Oh,
but the local people, particularly the local priesthood, they absolutely prevented her from going inside. She had to barricade herself inside the church because she was attacked by a mob. They rang the bells of the church to call the entire town, claiming that those archaeologists had come. They wanted to steal the mummies of their ancestors. They wanted to penetrate into the sanctuary. And she had to be rescued after 3 days by the police.
oh my God. 3 days. My God. Did she ever? I guess she didn't get underground
She
though.
never came back. She never came back.
Oh my God. So you talk about religious fanaticism. That sounds just like that. As we conclude, Marco, what is the next phase of the Mitla research that you're doing? Talk about what you're up to and what you hope to gain in this part two.
Well, we're now working on the permits, on the authorization for conducting some initial drilling into those subterranean chambers, but those permits will still take some time. We're currently analyzing different technical solutions as to how we may be able to drill down to the depth of 15, 18 meters, so 50, 60 feet below the ground. So that may still take one time. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to conduct the first drilling or the first probes potentially next year in 26. For the time being, we're opening up a new research front at the nearby site called Teotitlan del Valle, which is a very fascinating Zapotec site. It's located only a few kilometers from Mitla. There are rumors and traditions of tunnels connecting Teotitlan to Mitla, so part of the same subterranean network. And it's very clear if you go to Teotitlan that the main church of the site was built on top of very extensive Zapotec ruins. There are some huge megalithic stone blocks, beautifully carved with geometric shapes. You may see some of those in the video that I posted, where you can see very similar stonework to what you find in Mitla, for instance, but all of that has been reused in the local church and in many buildings throughout the center of the modern town of Teotitlan. There is also a small portion of what looks like a pre-Hispanic platform, very similar to the platform upon which the palaces of Mitla were built. So all these tells us that Teotitlan was a very important ancient Zapotec ceremonial center, very much like Mitla, but it's completely unexplored. So the idea is to use the same kind of geophysical methods to probe deeper under the ground and see if those rumors about subterranean tunnels and tombs in Teotitlan are true, whether there may be a connection also with the underworld of Mitla, and in general to create a map of the ancient pre-Hispanic site of Teotitlan. Something that I'm sure you will find fascinating is the name of the place itself. Teotitlan literally means the city of the gods. So that's a pretty fascinating name for a pre-Hispanic site, and that suggests that the site itself may have had a much greater importance in pre-Hispanic times than the small village of Teotitlan has today.
Yeah, it's a remarkable discovery, Marco, and I can see why you're energized by it. I would, and I'm just completely just throwing this out to you, and I'm sure you know, you guys must have one or two sites that you would like to earmark for excavation, I would think. Perhaps one of these areas that the priests covered, which is
Mhm.
maybe adobe, which would be easier than going through solid rock. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? So,
Well, we are hopeful that more entrances can be found. Clearly, the entrance under the church was not the only entrance to these subterranean tunnel system. And so we're hopeful, and to your point, we have at least a couple of target locations that could be potential blocked up entrances in other parts of the site. So these will be prime targets for future research and future excavation.
Excellent. Okay, well, we're at the end of our program. This is fascinating, wonderful work, Marco. Talk about ARX project, and you're always looking for support. Talk about what people can do to be supportive of your research and a part of this megalithic discovery.
Well, the ARCS project is a private non-profit research foundation, so we rely entirely on private donors and funding in order to support our work, our research at different sites across Mexico, San Miguel Ixtapan, at Mitla, now at Teotitlán del Valle. We've been able to raise several tens of thousands of dollars over the past few years through several hundreds of donors in Mexico, in the US, and abroad, who have generously contributed so that this research could continue. And even now, for this new phase of research in Teotitlán del Valle and in Mitla, we're actively looking for sponsorship. So if you or anyone who is listening can chip in, I invite you to support our research. We have set up a GoFundMe page, or you can also donate through Patreon, through PayPal, to support this research. This is important so that all of our research fundings can remain public. A big part of what we do and the mission of the ARCS Foundation is making sure that everything that we find, everything that is discovered, can be published, that it can be communicated. Because that's what happens very often with these kind of research. It just gets buried, findings are never published. Not necessarily calling it censorship, but you do find with many of these projects, you do not hear about the findings for many, many years, or maybe never. In our case, it's a big part of our mission to make sure that we publish these results. They are made available to the general public because we think this is important knowledge into the origins of humanity, so that by supporting us, you're also supporting a view, a vision of research in which these findings are shared broadly with the public, with the community, and everybody has access to these findings, to this research, which is potentially so transformational to our understanding of the ancient past.
Give us the website and how people can actually donate. I guess you go to, tell us what the website is.
Yes,
Address.
so the website is ARX, as in ARX project.org. We've also set up a GoFundMe page. We have a Facebook page as well. We have a Patreon page where you can go to by just searching for ARX project. We have a YouTube channel, so you can donate, you can support us in many, many different ways.
And have, other than the videos, Marco, is there anything that's been published by your research team?
Yes, there have been several academic articles that have been published. One just recently, a couple of months ago, in Archaeological Prospection, which is one of the main academic journals that deal with the use of geophysical methods in archaeology. There was a conference last year in New Orleans at which many of the findings from the first two seasons of the Mitla project were presented, and many other articles also in the international press. We had very good coverage from the New York Times, Smithsonian Magazine, from National Geographic as well. So the news of our discoveries at Mitla had received pretty broad coverage in the international press. And obviously, we have at least two more academic articles that are currently in the peer review process and will hopefully be published soon. Also, all of our sponsors, all of our supporters have access, and we've given them access to the full research report, which is an almost 600 pages document that contains all the original data from the research research findings, which is again like part of our effort to make all of these data, all of these research results available to the public.
I imagine National Geographic doing a TV special on tunnels. If you break down and get into one of those chambers, they're going to want to be there. You know?
Hopefully so. That would be fantastic.
Hey, Marco, always intriguing and fun to be speaking with you. For those of you listening, Marco is also the author of The Empires of Atlantis. It's a great book, came out a couple of years ago. And he mentioned to me he's coming up with another book. So fantastic. Great research. And thanks for the update, Marco, and continued success.
Thank you so much, Cliff. Always a pleasure.